So this interview is part of a larger project I'm working on, really trying to explore why it is that Canada has fallen from third to 46th in e-government rankings. And it's something that's a question I've been wrestling with for a while that I feel personally responsible for to a certain extent, because I worked for the government on digital transformation during this period of time. So I want to do some digging to figure out like what actually happened, what could we have done differently, and where's this all going. So stay tuned. The video is going to come out at some point in the future. In the meantime, I hope you enjoyed this interview I just did. All right. Well, welcome to the very first ever Civic Punks podcast interview. I've brought my friend Viet in here to be my guinea pig. So, Viet, thank you so much for being my guinea pig. And let's see how this goes. This is going to be a giant adventure. Why don't we start? Why don't you introduce yourself? Tell me all about who you are and what brings you here today.
No, thanks, Derek, and hopefully I'll be a good lab rat to you for your future innovations in this space. But my name is Viet Vu. I am currently the manager of economic research at the DAIS at Toronto Metropolitan University. And so we are a public policy and leadership think tank that focuses especially on how technology is impacting the economy as well as sort of wider democratic processes in Canada. And I've also had the fortune for the past, I guess, couple of years on focusing as one of my research areas in the process of sort of digital government. And so, how governments can actually build digital services and connect with its citizens through a digital platform.
Amazing. And one of the reasons I wanted to reach out to Viet, other than I knew he'd be a good sport to my guinea pig, is I really wanted to, with this podcast, YouTube channel, to dig into some questions I've been wrestling with within sort of the public sector innovation space. And one question that sort of really I'm stuck with, and is kind of personal for me, is this question of why is it that Canada keeps falling in the e-government rankings? You know, we were as high as third in 2010, and we're now, I think, 46th in the world. That's a pretty intense drop off. And why this is personal for me is I worked in the government of Canada for 6 years on digital while this was happening. So I am culpable, and the people I admire and look up to, and a lot of friends of mine are also culpable, or like we're part of why we are falling. So I'm trying to understand like what's going on, because there's some amazing people who've been doing great work in this space for a while. But I really wanted to connect with you, Viet, around this because you were part of a report that the DAIS released last fall, called Byte-Sized Progress, assessing digital transformation in the government of Canada, that really looked at this question of what's going on and why are we falling. So I thought you'd be a really good person to start with, to sort of try to peel this back and like,
Hopefully, I'll be
what is
good.
going on.
Yeah.
Well, let's find out. So to start things off, let's sort of use it like as a baseline. You know, how did you and as well the UN evaluate digital maturity in the government of Canada? Like, how are we evaluating Canada and the world when it comes to digital maturity within the government?
Yeah, I guess the place that I'll start this conversation, right, is that there are two conceptually very different things. The way that sort of UN assesses e-government index is what it's called, and then the way we sort of examined Canadian governments and federal government sort of digital maturity. And so let's start with the UN. And so the UN e-government index, its goal is really in ranking both the capabilities and the institutional capacity of governments all around the world in delivering digital services to its citizens. And so it's not just about digital government. It's sort of the first thing that you understand about the e-government index in the UN. Because if you actually look at the set of indicators that they use, they actually include a whole bunch of things that are sort of infrastructure in nature. Let's say how many people in the country are connected to the internet. And so it also has that idea of how big the potential demand, if you will, for government digital services might be. And then it assesses the government on a whole bunch of metrics from availability of different services, whether it has sort of a governing structure, let's say a dedicated sort of digital department that deals with creating digital government services and everything. And then it basically ranks about 190 plus UN member countries along a composite index. And so it's a measurement tool and it's a comparative ranking tool. That's the way they understand the UN framework of measuring digital government. The way that we actually went to assess, by us, I mean the DAIS here, assess sort of federal government of Canada's digital maturity is a bit more conceptual, that is to mean a framework. And the sort of a subtle difference here, right? With a ranking, you kind of get to see where you are amongst your other peer countries. With the framework that we created, it's much more of a language to talk about the issue, to frame the issue, to potentially identify problems, to identify things that we're good at, to identify things that we're not very good at. And so that you don't really need to compare across different countries. Because the goalpost we can kind of set, right? It's the oftentimes the conversation goes that we're better than the US on a whole number of social dimensions. And then we're like, well, should we really be setting the US as a bar for these kinds of conversations? And so just by focusing specifically on coming up with a set of unique language to talk about the problems and opportunities that exist in digital government in Canada, that allows you to then really focus on how to improve the digital government sort of processes in Canada, as opposed to sort of losing track of what is important because you try to standardize everything to compare to like 190 plus countries.
That makes sense to me. Why don't we start then by you sent me this really excellent chart here that looks at the evolution of digital rankings. So let's see. I've never done share screen, so we're going to see how this works. So we're going to share screen, and we're going to do entire. We're going to do this one here. Okay. So this here is the table you saw, and one thing that's interesting. So e-government rankings really starts in 2003. And then we see the red line or pinkish red line here being Canada compared against China, South Korea, and the United States. And one of the things that I find really interesting is that for the most part, Canada is pretty high. I mean, we're fifth. We kind of dropped down to, I think, seventh, sixth, seventh in that range, eighth, and then back up to as high as third in 2010. So I guess my first question for you is, what happened? Like, why were we so good before 2010? Let's start with the positive. What allowed us to be so successful in the first 10 years of this?
So I think that the big context of all of these conversations, right, is that there are many, many different explanations. And so I'm going to cover some of the major ones that I think contributed to the dynamics that we're seeing here. But that doesn't mean that any of the stuff that I don't cover is any less important, right? Let's sort of start. The first caveat that you need to understand to actually appropriately sort of analyze this graph is that these are rankings. And so one way for you to drop your ranking without things getting worse is if you just kind of stand still and everyone else keeps moving forward. That's one way for you to also drop a ranking. And so you don't necessarily have to get worse at it. You just need to move slower than everyone else. And then you still end up with a case that you can't keep up with everyone's progress and then sort of declining. And so that, I think, understanding allows you to actually tell a very compelling story of what happened in Canada. Because this might be a surprising fact to many here, but Canada was amongst the first country in the world, sort of in the late 90s period, I think it was in 1999, that actually created a whole of government sort of funded program called the Government Online Initiative, the OLI, or the GOL, the GOL initiative, that literally was beyond its times in recognizing that, hey, at the turn of the millennia, internet and digital technology is going to be a big thing. And so we're going to create this new office, give a very clear mandate, fund it appropriately. I think initially it was supposed to run until about 2004, and then it got extended until like 2005, 2006, where a lot of that initial waves of digitization happened. And so the reason why Government Canada was very, very high in that United Nations e-government ranking right at the precipice of the millennium is very much, I think, because of that. There was a first of the world, well-funded and well-structured initiative that created all of these sort of digital infrastructure for the Canadian government that sort of like hasn't existed before. Now, perhaps the big reason why it has kind of stalled and then kind of stayed until then is kind of what I said, that the program Government Online Initiative sort of concluded in 2006, 2007 period, and then nothing really replaced it in that same scale. And the same scale here is very, very important because there's this idea that, hey, Canadian Digital Service, that has been a big, big contributor to the current government effort to digitize. There's also been a lot of department by department initiative, as well as things like different functions. Let's say shared services Canada implementing a new HR function, a new financial function, even transition during COVID, where everyone kind of had to start using Teams all at once in the Canadian government. But none of that, I don't think you can claim was centrally coordinated and existed within the same sort of government mandate that existed, as we recognize that that is the most important thing possible. And that matters because if there is a same common shared vision, you can also create a culture. That means that every single person, when they're making decisions in government, whether that be how to design a specific policy, how to design a specific government service, they include digital in the conversation right on the get-go because there's this mandate and it is sort of a central mandate. And so you can create a culture around it. And so that's sort of the first aspect that we see is surrounding the fact that they tried and was quite successful at creating that culture, a digital first mindset, the internet first mindset, that meant every piece of government information started being on websites. And then they kind of stopped. But and then there are a couple of others, but I feel like you want to say something on that.
Well, yeah, it's kind of interesting because I definitely have heard. I mean, back then it was e-government. It was like this whole digital thing. That's post, that's just in the last decade or so. In the early 2000s, it was the e-government movement. I heard like websites. We were the first one of the first governments to really move into the website space with our programming and stuff like that. I
Mhm.
guess the question that I am sort of stuck on is, I mean, you see it here in the graph, 2010. 2010, that was the high water mark, and then we just kind of, and I mean, I think you kind of alluded to it in the sense that because it's a comparison, this isn't so much, it's not just a narrative of us, it's a narrative of everybody else as well. And so there was
Yeah.
a huge push from everybody else to become more digital. I mean, 2010, this is right around the time that GDS was created, USDS was created, and you saw this whole digital service units starting to
Yeah.
spread around the world. That was right around 2010. We
Yeah.
were obviously, I think, CDS is what, 2016,
That feels
2018,
right. Yeah. When
somewhere
the
in that
government
range.
acquired it. Yeah. No.
Yeah, so that we were slow to that for sure. But I guess I'm really curious, and maybe some of your other rationale explain like what happened in 2010 or what shifted
Yeah.
right around that point to cause us to start falling further and further behind everybody else.
So there are, I think, a couple of explanations. One, um, that feels at least to me compelling, right? Is that 2010, I don't think is necessarily a special year.
Hmm.
Um, I think the slightly better understanding is kind of think about the Canadian context that Canada's always the first to an exciting new digital trend. And then it really fails to follow through on actually enacting all of those things. And let's think more recently. Canada was the first to have a pan-Canadian AI strategy. That was the first in the world that talked about, hey, talent strategy, research strategy, commercialization strategy. And then it took until basically this CFO has to announce about $2 billion in funding for compute. Well, what happened? I think literally a couple of days ago, the US announced 500 billion US dollars.
Yep.
And that kind of makes the 2 billion look so cute, right? And that happened with AI. That I think also kind of happened with quantum back in sort of 2015 when Canada started creating its quantum strategy. And now are we sort of world leading when it comes to quantum? I would argue that's not necessarily the case. So I don't think that this is sort of unique to sort of digital government in Canada. I think in if you talk to a lot of tech founders and innovators in Canada, it's this ethos that government of Canada loves to pilot new initiative and new technology, but doesn't actually want to commit long term on any piece of technology. And so I think a huge chunk of that is reflective of this sort of same trend that we're seeing. Now, what doesn't help are sort of government changes that took place, let's say in 2006, right around the time when that government e-government initiative was sort of ending, there was a change in government from not necessarily like a political party point here, but a change in government's always going to be disruptive. And then there was also a financial crisis in between that meant that, hey, perhaps they couldn't really afford to spend government resources on these kinds of infrastructure initiative. And those aren't necessarily, I would say, are things that are existential to government digital maturity, but I don't think neither of those things really helped break apart sort of the cycle of piloting something, becoming really excited by it, and not really following through on it.
That's actually an interesting point because one of the things that I mean the first place my mind went when I looked at this is like a change in government, but I look at where the peaks and valleys are, and it isn't aligned with where the
No?
government's changed. Right? It was where like the Conservatives came in what 2006 I think it
Yeah,
was,
yeah.
and then Trudeau won his election, and the Liberals that was 2015
2015.
2016. That's when
Yep.
that happened, and you that's not like that's like those are inconsequential. The financial crisis is an interesting one. Um, I can
But
see
again,
that
I
having a big
think
impact
both
on
of those
things.
are things that probably didn't help, but I don't think fully explains why this happened, right?
Yeah.
Because again, you look at a place like China, in fact, they started rising in the e-government ranking right around and right after the financial crisis. Korea, who was also certainly impacted by the global financial crisis, managed to stay relatively stable throughout it all. And so again, these I think things that didn't help, but also isn't really how do I put this, consequential enough.
Before we move on to the next thing, is there anything else that you wanted to sort of pull out from this graph here that you think is important to think about as we wrestle with this question of what's happening in Canada?
Yeah, so I think there's a second thing that I'm not quite sure how to wrap my head around, which surrounds the idea of talent.
Mm.
And I think talent is especially important in understanding this graph here, because up until about 2020, the vast majority of federal government staff that were really critical and were the people who were involved in many of these initiatives had to be located in Ottawa. And there used to be, until about 2003, 2004, a very reliable company that was based in Ottawa that provided many such technical talent. You talk to many people who have been studying the innovation ecosystem in Canada in a while, and inevitably the name Nortel will come to mind. They will lament the age of Nortel in Canada. That was sort of the maverick of Canadian innovation ecosystem. But it is true that that meant that a lot of wonderful technical talent was concentrated in Ottawa. And once you're in that local ecosystem, you obviously experience some spillover effect of talent moving around, of sort of government procurement happening, and that probably also had a role to play after the fall of Nortel, that you can keep your talent in Ottawa for a couple of years, but then inevitably new opportunities arise and they move away. And now, with Shopify having its office there, but they'll probably think of moving most of their operations into a slightly different ecosystem. I don't think there has been any draw to retain some of those really top technical talent at the time in a place like Ottawa. And so I do think that sort of talent deficit becomes the second major driver of this sort of stagnation, perhaps.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting. I mean, first off, I should give a shout to my friend David Durant on the Nortel reference because he used to work for Nortel and made me watch a whole entire documentary with him about the fall of Nortel. But for context, for those of you who don't know, Nortel was a massive company, tech company, based out of Ottawa in Canada that had a very significant and sudden fall from grace and collapsed within a matter of months. It's very dramatic, enough worth making a documentary about. And yeah, I can definitely see that being something that would cause talent to bleed out. I wonder, I wonder as well. During this time, like there's stuff like GTech. GTech was this conference that happened, and it was a major conference that brought public servants directly in line with vendors to learn about like what's the front edge of tech and to be able to procure solutions. And there's a real cross mixing that GTech allowed that was somewhat controversial because of its close nature of connection with the private sector, and definitely I know a lot of people I went to who that I know who went to GTech had their misgivings about the nature of relationships between the private sector and government at the time. And
Mhm.
changes in procurement laws led to GTech no longer being a viable model.
Right.
And so there's a couple of years when this was falling, like GTech was the early days, and then GTech was canceled, and there's a gap when there really wasn't a chance for the majority of public servants to engage directly with the tech world. And it's only
Yep.
been in the last few years where Forward 50 has come in to sort of fill that gap and has a completely different approach to that relationship that is one that is near and dear to my heart. I'm a huge fan of what Forward 50 is doing. But I wonder if that gap again, this whole idea of talent and where do we learn and how do we, that cross pollination of ideas, but also people. That's a really good point that I think you're onto something with that.
Yeah, no, I think that is a wonderful point, right? Because when Nortel was still in Ottawa, Ottawa was a center of technology, especially when it comes to telecommunications technology, which incidentally is exactly when Canadian government was really, really good at sort of telecom related things, putting websites on and creating new ways for citizens to actually communicate with and interact with government. And those meeting places are important because these days, I think they're the big tech hubs in Canada. Used to be Toronto, by used to be, I do specifically mean the Web Summit with Collision, the biggest sort of tech conference that happens in North America, was housed in Toronto for like 3, 4 years running. Last year was the last year that that was going to be hosted. Now it's moving to Vancouver. And so you can imagine sort of bureaucrats trying to interact with the cutting edge technology, not only last year having to have to travel to Toronto to get it, this year they actually have to go all the way to Vancouver in order to actually access some of these networks and be part of the community, which is really difficult, right? Because when there is that geographic distance, you can't constantly be in contact with each other. Even though this sort of shift to digital work, remote work is really, really wonderful and has allowed a lot of people to work from many different places. One area that in-person interaction continues to be superior in is sort of collaborative problem solving. And guess what? That is what you need in order to do digital in government. You take a technical solution and then you actually try to figure out how to tweak that solution to fit with a very unique challenge that government faces. And you actually gain a lot of value being in the same physical room when you're doing that process.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting. I was having a conversation with a friend of mine in the UK government a couple of days ago, and we talked about how so much happens through soft networks
Yeah.
and informal interactions. That's sort of the thing, the secret, not secret about government is that a lot of stuff actually happens in informal spaces to get unstuck from the heavy process bureaucracy that is sort of the main stage. The
Yeah.
problem is that when the pandemic happened, everybody went home and the spaces that enabled for these soft connections and these interactions, this knowledge sharing to happen disappeared. And they haven't really come back. And this is something that he felt that was slowing government down in terms of its processes. And I think he's onto something with that.
Yeah,
I
I,
just
I
want to,
think he is as well. If I could comment one thing on that idea of soft interactions and in fact the fact that not many people know about it, right? Is I think trust plays a huge, huge role in allowing those soft interactions to take place. And what I mean by that is an institution such as the government or any institution relies largely on actually norms and sort of practices, principles, as opposed to sort of legislated, codified sort of rules and laws and regulations. It's kind of a tacit agreement that no one really needs to uphold, except for the fact that everyone respect and trust in the institution enough to uphold those norms, right? And the reason why I bring this up is I do think one of the other reason why those kind of soft interactions hasn't really recovered to the same level is because I think there has been an erosion of trust in government. There has been an erosion of trust that government actions are there to benefit people. Every single government in the world suffered through this with the pandemic. In fact, one of those like striking graphic, right, is that I think every single incumbent government that was in power when COVID hit has lost an election. And maybe we'll see that in Canada as well. There's an election coming up soon. But once you lose that trust, that means that you also lose that social license because now the way that those soft interaction is interpreted by the public transforms completely and significantly.
yeah.
What used to be perhaps, in fact, an effective way for government to do its job by actually very informally reaching out to a couple of different technology vendors to test out solutions, whether the problem definition makes sense or not, will now be viewed through the lens of, oh, is this cronyism? Is this another ArriveCAN app fiasco of someone being favorited and given a contract? And so I do think that environment of trust and the erosion of it has also hampered a lot of these informal network formations and the informal workings of government.
Well, this that actually raises. There's a couple of areas I want to dig deeper in with you, and one of them is sort of one you alluded to. Um, One of the things that your report talks about, and I know I saw firsthand, is how much the government of Canada has become dependent upon external contractors to do a
Yeah.
lot of digital work. And so this, I mean, you talked about within the context of digital skills, how much of those digital skills are being sort of moving out of government into these third sector, third spaces. But one of the things that really stood out for me that I wanted to sort of ask, and I have some ideas of my own, but I want to hear what your thoughts are, is the government spent a ton of money on IT contracts, a ton of money on IT. I mean, relative to Canada, obviously we're not in the same like size and scope as the United States, but for a country like I think it's what you said, like our second biggest expenditure is
Any
IT related.
out of any like procurement contract, yeah.
Yeah, which is crazy. And despite the fact the government has been doing this for a while and throwing a lot of money at IT, we are where we are. Why
Yeah.
is that the case? Why is it, even though, I mean, we could debate, I mean, there is a whole other debate about whether government should be outsourcing so much. But before we get into that discussion, what's going on? Why is it that even though government's spending a ton of money, we're not seeing the results that money should give us?
Yeah, so I think the kicker is that that money that we ordinarily think as government spending on IT, that's literally the tip of the iceberg. Because we actually have no way to know how much government spends like money on digital initiatives internally. We only know how much they pay external vendors for these digital initiatives and sort of digital contract. But in fact, I think Senator Colin Deacon or one of the senators actually asked the Parliamentary Budget Office for an accounting how much government actually spends internally just on digital initiative, and the answer was, we don't actually know because we can't really have a consistent way to come up with that number. And so I think there are a couple of things at play here. First is what I think you mentioned that you read in the work that we have done. Whoever like gets contracted to deliver digital services to government, like that doesn't matter. What matters is how well those contractors are actually managed, and the management of those contractors need to remain within the government of Canada. And so you actually need a contingent of highly talented, highly technical sort of talent within the government of Canada who actually know, let's say, how to write the RFP, the request for proposals, how to evaluate the request for proposal on technical merit, working alongside those who are public policy experts, those who understand that, hey, technology is just a tool and government is here to serve people. And you actually need not only both of those talent, but essentially people who can actually communicate and translate with each other. And government, I think, has gotten that one half down, but people who understand government as a service, as a way to serve people, the non-technical side. But I do think that there's unfortunately a lack of that deep technical expertise. And the reason is that's not because of lack of motivation. You talk to any chief digital officers and any government department, and they know that they need to build this. But that is, I think, a reality. One of those reality is compensation. The moment that you move to private sector,
Yeah.
you get paid a lot more. The moment you move even to the States, as opposed to staying in Canada as a technical talent, you get paid a lot more. And within that, I think fiscal reality, that is that challenge of retaining that top talent that exists.
Well, I don't even think it's. I mean, definitely finances is like getting paid more is part of it, but I've had a lot of friends in the government of Canada who've left into consulting, for example, and talking with them, the biggest thing that caused them to leave and what they're most excited about with this opportunity in consulting is just flexibility to work on projects that where you feel like you have an impact. That, as a consultant, you seem to have more influence on the system and you can work across more projects and you're not caught up in the sludge that is the process of government. So it's in you're free. And so they felt like they could have more impact, which I think for a lot of people who are really deep in the space, it's not the money, it's the ability to have impact and make a difference for your country that motivates a lot of these people. And they were finding that they could do more of that outside of government, which is, I mean, that's a telling sort of anecdote, I think, about
Yes,
how we're setting
although I
ourselves up
think
for
the one way
success.
that I challenge that, right, is I hear you on the idea of impact, but what I think motivate a lot of people tend to be the speed at which they can have that impact. And I don't necessarily think that's a problem with government. That is to say that government, by design, for very good reason, is designed to move slowly. Because it creates these consequential changes. The best analogy I often use in talking about this, right, is the idea of standards.
Mm.
Sort of standards that govern how everything should look to ensure that like there isn't any big discongruency between designs. But guess what? Standards is designed to move slowly. You do not want a new standard to change every 6 months and then having to catch up. And so, in that same manner, deliberately, for very good reasons, government is designed slowly to move slowly. And so I do think that there is that slow movingness that isn't the issue because you look at any sort of big sort of IT project, regardless of whether you're in the public sector or private sector, and they can usually take 5, 6 years, even up to a decade to complete. And that's not necessarily different across sort of a small government versus private sector. It's actually a small organization versus large organization thing. And so I challenge that notion in the sense that I do think that if you can find technical talent, in big organizations because big companies, big organizations also move almost as slowly as governments do. You should be able to find people who want to work in such an environment in the government as well.
I think it's a fair point. Definitely, people I know who've gone into big companies have wrestled with that as well. And I think ultimately you need different personalities in different parts of the system. There's certain parts of the system that need to move fast, and other parts that need to move slow. And it's, I mean, there's a guy named Gord Guthrie who I love his stuff, who talks about the gearbox of government. And I think there's different parts need to move at different speeds, and then you have to find a way that you bring these different speed moving gears into sync so they actually work together. Um,
100%. And then that's why I think I really like this idea that has taken place, idea of a sandbox, right? And I think Taiwan has done this idea really, really well,
yeah.
both in terms of like open source development ideas, but also like just rapid piloting, figuring out what works on a small scale, and then sort of going from that small scale proven solution and scaling it up right out in the open, which really has allowed Taiwan sort of digital services and Taiwan digital Ministry of Digital Government to sort of flourish. Is that like rapid iteration, the sandbox that you can't mess things up too much by trying and testing and breaking things apart?
It's a good point. There's two more things. I'm just keeping an eye on time, and there's two more things I want to get through with you. So one, it's sort of playing around this, sticking with the IT contract bit. One thing that I came across when I was working in the government was realizing that we kind of do this to ourselves. So we buy these big contracts for these tools, these platforms, these systems, and these systems then don't seem to work well for us. I mean, Phoenix being probably the most high-profile one, at least within the government of Canada, but there's lots. There's tons that you can look at. I remember, what was it? GC Docs is another one that we had a friend of mine who was in charge of the GC Docs file for a while, and I had this really interesting conversation with him where he basically said, one of the challenges we ran into is that the platform behind underneath GC Docs runs way better than what we have. And the reason why is that when it entered into government, it got fractured into all these different pieces, and it was basically running at a sub-optimum level because it's so fractured, because there's all these restraints put on it that we put on it as government. So what we're buying and what we're getting are two different things, not because of the private sector contractor that we're buying it from, but because of our own rules, expectations. I mean, one of the things you talked about in the report is how everything is so fractured at a departmental level, and each department has its own fiefdom of architecture, legacy architecture. This is what GC Docs ran into, is that you're bringing it in and you have to then fit it into these each department's own legacy tech stack, which is different, and that just leads to a complete mess.
Yeah, absolutely, right. And then I think the further thinking that I've had on that, which I think in the work we sort of recommend this idea of like a shared platform,
Mm.
kind of like a shared environment, so that you can in fact customize some of these, is this idea that like I feel as if oftentimes with government technology, it doesn't get quote unquote launched until every single little feature is in fact programmed, is there. There isn't really a difference between what is a core feature versus, let's say, what is in a version 1.1 patch or a version 1.6 patch, or let's say a special API that adds this like very specific niche capabilities. And so instead of that's essentially like launching a minimum viable product that allows you to do the core simple things and then having an understanding that, hey, there are all of these associated side things you still need to do, but let's make sure these core functionalities work really well first. And then once it does, which is much cheaper to develop, you can then add on to these things. You can actually allow APIs to be built. App
Yeah,
APIs, for those who don't know, essentially like interface that allows people to actually leverage the core infrastructure of the software to build new functionalities based on those core infrastructures and integrated things really well into it. And so I do think that this idea of a shared platform needs can only exist if there is a much better conversation on what is sort of the core sort of tool that you need versus all of these small features that are super task specific or program specific, department specific, that doesn't need to be there in the initial launch, that you can actually decentralize the construction of after you ensure that core functionality is tested well, is working well at the beginning.
absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, you don't have to sell me on this. I'm all for it. Uh,
Yeah, yeah.
all right. I quickly want to jump to sort of the final thing I wanted to chat with you about. And I want to go back to your report. So I'm going to share screen again. So obviously, I mean, you guys, fantastic report. I'll definitely link to it, encourage people to read it. You basically, I mean, talked about your digital maturity models having these sort of three different pieces: the digital culture, the digital skills, and I think we've covered a lot of the digital culture and the digital skills already. The one I really wanted to sort of talk more about was digital access, because this is where Canada struggles the most. Of all of these, this is the one that we really struggle with. And part of that's not really our fault because it's the nature of our geography. We're a massive country, and it is really hard to get good digital infrastructure to some of the more remote places that people are living. And you mentioned in a report specifically, like the indigenous communities in particular are the ones that have
Yeah.
really been left behind with this in many cases. But rural people and like just rural communities in general have really
Yeah.
struggled with this. So I guess maybe unpack this and like what can we do about this? Because this is probably the hardest one to crack just because of
Yeah.
how resource intensive it is to actually deal with.
100%. And I think the place that you start this is by setting the actual correct goalpost. The to illustrate this point, right? The again my line, another sort of field that I study is like AI adoption in Canadian economy. My thing is, you know, the number that we have, which is that about 4 to 6% of Canadian businesses has adopted AI in a core business function, that number is kind of meaningless until we define where it is that we're trying to get to. Because we probably don't need 100% of Canadian businesses to be adopting AI. We probably don't need like, the corner stores that you buy a bottle of water at like 2 a.m. in the morning to be using AI in many capacity.
What
We
are you doing at
probably
2 a.m. in the morning getting water from a
Hey, man,
corner store?
we live in Toronto. It's actually very, very exciting here. Um, but we also probably don't want, the production of Lion King that's happening just down the
Yeah.
street from where I am right now to be using AI. In fact, that probably is something we want to avoid happening, like consciously and actively. And so, just in that similar sense, our goal should not be to ensure that every single person in the country can access digital technology. Because if you sort of take that goalpost and flip it around, that means that we are investing in ensuring that there's no physical way to access your services. And that's also not a good future either, for a variety of different reasons. Because number one, if you just rely on the internet as a point of access to government services, that's a single point of failure. It just needs one internet outage to ensure that every single government services now no longer functions. And again, being realistic about Canada's sort of digital access challenges, the rural access challenges, Indigenous peoples' access challenges, and with Indigenous peoples and Indigenous nations, it's not even just about access, it's also, again, about that idea of trust. Because sort of with digital technology, there is necessarily a component of it that involves collection of data. There is necessarily a component of that which involves sort of sending your data to this faceless screen. You don't know the actual individual you might be dealing with. And given the traumatic history that many Indigenous nations has had interacting with the Canadian government, that is likely not the best approach in ensuring that these Indigenous peoples have access to government services. And so the goal here should be ensuring every single Canadians and people who live in Canada have access to government services. And digital sort of government services is just one sort of access sort of axes, if you will, you need to ensure that all of the other sort of ways to access government services is still there. So oftentimes I say that, hey, you should spend 20% of your resources to ensure that 80% of Canadians get to access government services because there is a cost advantage to digital services, right? But that doesn't mean that you then just say, hey, these 80% of the budget, we can just cut it. We probably want to actually therefore spend the exactly the same budget. So you're still achieving like a 60% cost saving because you're now at 40% of the original cost. But that 20% that you have left over, you spend to ensure that all of those people, either for lack of actual infrastructure or lack of need or demand because they actually want to interact with government through a medium that isn't digital, it could be in person through phones, to serve those 20% of people. And so I think that change in mindset is needed of what the actual goalpost is so that we can actually make those appropriate investment in not making sure that digital services doesn't get stalled because, oh, hey, there'll always be people who can't access it because there will always be people who can't access your new service. But you have to think of digital services complementary to non-digital services as opposed to an outright replacement of it, which I think some have sort of like interpreted to be that, and even some government services has sort of gone that way as well.
Well, I mean, when I was working for the government of Canada on this file, that the term that was used a lot was omni-channel. You know, the idea that people should be able to access services through multiple channels based on their preference and what makes sense where they are. And omni-channel, yes, includes, digital methods, smartphones,
Yeah,
but it also included much more analog, different store shops and
yeah, yeah, yeah.
physical spaces, and recognizing that you want all of them available to people, and that really frees things up for sure.
Yeah, and like as a clear example of this, right? We actually saw in COVID with the vaccine passports,
Hmm.
and so there was actually this one moment that this was understandably provincial as opposed to federal. For much of the vaccine coordination was happening at the provincial level, but I actually had the fortune of working in the front lines at those vaccine clinics. I happen to speak like four different languages. It therefore was very helpful to translate for people who didn't speak English. And so, up until about the Omicron wave, it was actually very easy and part of the standard process to print out the QR code that any machine can scan and shows that, hey, you're actually vaccinated. And because a lot of people didn't necessarily have a smartphone or didn't necessarily have data plans on their phone, especially when it comes to lower income folks, even in Toronto. And so, as a standard process, we printed those QR codes every time that they came in. The receipt that actually has a QR code that shows you the dosage. That was all good and well. Except there was a point around Omicron wave, which was sort of like December 2021-ish, going into 2022, where we were actually instructed that, hey, we don't print these by default anymore. And further to that, the easy sort of one button access to print the receipt was actually removed from the platform. And so the maneuver to actually print the receipt out, actually we had to go through a government website, the government portal that is separate from the internal sort of database that we were using. And so after we would vaccinate someone, we would actually have to have like a dedicated iPad or help people navigate through the Ontario Health portal to then get to this PDF to be able to print it out. And so again, this was one of those moments where I really thought about the fact that, hey, why are we like in the name of streamlining services, let's say, you actually removed one sort of like really important access channel for this like very vital government service at the time.
Yeah, I'd be curious to know what was the reason for that change, because there's always a rationale for things, not
Yeah.
necessarily a good rationale, but there's a rationale, and
But
I'm curious what that would be for that.
and yeah, but like, I think that's a key part, right? Is that I'm pretty sure that they had a good rationale given the goal and the mandate that was
Mm.
given to them. And mandate could be something like a single access portal to a vaccine proof. And so you create a website and then you route every single database through that website, and then you close up every other ways that you can actually access that database. And that is design and that is good, but like that's my entire point about the idea of all of these three components, the culture, the skills, access being interconnected, right? Because if that was the right digital culture, those considerations of, as you call it, omnichannel would have been front and center when that mandate was written.
Mm.
If there were digital skills to implement it appropriately, they would have been able to funnel all of the data through that single portal without necessarily closing off that other access channel into that like vaccine receipt. And if there was a good language to talk about digital access and actual assessment of where people are and the kind of access points that they need, then none of this would have happened. And so this is sort of the point that we make, that you can't have a good and mature digital government in Canada without any of these three components.
Yeah, no, it makes complete sense to me. We're basically at time. Via, I want to give you any final thoughts or reflections, particularly around this question of, what's happening in Canada around e-government, around our digital government. Why do we keep sliding? I think we've covered a lot of it, and thank you for the insights. Have been really helpful for me. I now think of it differently thanks to what you've shared today. Any final pieces you want to add before we wrap up?
Yeah, I think that the one thing that I want to bring up, which if you're in this world of digital government in Canada, I'm sure have been weighing on a lot of people's mind, is again the fractionalization of sort of these central digital agencies that seems to have happened kind of all at once, even though perhaps was bubbling over the past couple of years. You know, Ontario Digital Service being quote unquote disbanded and distributed to different government departments. Canadian Digital Service sort of like going through the exact same fate. And that happening at the same time, at least at the federal level, and with, a Privy Council Office PCO actually starting up this whole AI adoption within government initiative that coordinated across many different departments, so that be ESDC, TBS, shared services, and all of those. And this massive sort of push to digitize government and allow government to adopt AI and use AI in a responsible and effective way. And I don't know where that will lead because, again, that at least to me right now, doesn't seem consistent. You can't at the same time have this sort of like massive all of government effort that has a clear mandate, a central mandate through PCO, yet at the same time kind of hamstring yourself by, let's say, distributing the talent in every single department without having a clear sort of governance structure, having a clear leadership structure. And so I do think that for that initiative that PCO is leading, which is absolutely beautiful and absolutely great, they should be pursuing those things. For it to be successful, I do think that they need to come up with a much clearer leadership structure, what to do with all of those digital talent that is now everywhere within government, as opposed to the fact that you just need to go to this one place to look for them.
Well, and it's interesting because like you look at different theories of change of how you get digital into the water supply, and there's this sort of idea that you start off with a specialized team where you can sort of incubate this talent, but then as it matures, you kind of spread it out across the whole entire system, and then you have this whole idea of, well, how do we coordinate across the whole entire system, and that sort of
Yeah.
seems where things are now. The other key factor with this, although we talked about earlier, not actually being as big of a factor as we thought it would be, is there's an election happening at some point this year, probably pretty soon, and most likely leading to, well, it'll always be a new government, but most likely
Yeah.
leading to a different party at the helm.
Yeah.
How will that impact the strategy that is being applied to how the government does digital? I think will be really interesting.
Yeah, although like I don't think it again will be as big a change because efficiency in government, I feel like, is just a cross-partisan issue. Every party can, in fact, run on that message, right? I know the conservative government is also, or like a conservative MPs that the government in waiting, I suppose, in opposition right now, have been talking about using AI to improve public service just as much as sort of liberal MPs and those who are in the liberal orientation who are in government right now. So I think it is actually a very cross political issue, this idea of like using technology to increase efficiency in government.
I was one thing. So last weekend, I was at UK Gov Camp, which
Yep.
is sort of this big UK gathering of public servants on the ground, very grassroots kind of conversations about where public service is at. One of the things that really jumped out at me was language. So in the case of the UK, there's a new government that's in. They're bringing in new language because there's this feeling that the digital language, quote unquote, has sort of baggage associated with it. There's an exclusivity to it, and they're trying
Yeah.
to make it more universal. And so one place where this is particularly poignant is like agile, agile, agile. Everybody's talking about agile. The new language in the UK government is test and learn. So
Yeah.
if you kind of scratch at it a bit, you're like, oh, this is agile. And but what they've done is they've reframed it as test and learn because they find it more inclusive and more
Yeah.
accessible to a larger number of people, and getting beyond sort of that group of geeky digital elites within the system into sort of a broader. And so I can see similar patterns playing out in Canada, particularly under a new government regime, where there's, digital will still be front and center, particularly through AI, but there'll probably be a shift in language. And that shift in language hopefully will lead to an expansion of people who are involved in the conversation.
Absolutely. No, I think that's true. And I think that will be important. That will be an important trend to keep track of.
Absolutely. Well, stay tuned for more. We'll be talking a lot more about that in more videos to come. Viet, thank you so much for being my guinea pig. I had a blast. Hopefully
No,
this
I did. I
recorded
had a lot of
okay.
fun
And
as well. Yeah, no, I had a lot of fun as well. Thank you.
we'll have to. I mean, because you're the first, it also means that you'll have to be the first person we bring back for a second time. So you can be, after 5 visits, you get like a watch or some type of award, a plaque or
I'll
something.
start sending like a deep fake version of me instead.
Oh yeah, I mean we're getting to the point of that being the case. That's true. Amazing. Well, why don't we wrap it there? Thank you so much. Yeah, stay tuned. More videos to come.
Oh, thanks, Derek.